presentations have become a required skill for today's profession. Yet, PowerPoint presentations are universally dreadful. So David Lecours is here to save the day. David is an award-winning graphic designer and professional speaker. Slide presentations lie at the intersection of David's passion for visual and verbal communication, which changed the world slide by slide. David Lecours.
Welcome. In year 2000, after winning and then losing the 2000 election, presidential, Al Gore returned to his passion, the environment. And what he did is he resumed a series of speeches that he'd been giving for years, specifically about climate change and how it was affecting, or being affected by global warming. Now in 2004, he was going back to his passion, which was giving these speeches about the environment, and he happened to be giving one at a town meeting in New York City. And this was one like he'd given many times, except there was one person in this audience that would start to change the future. And that person was named Lori. Lori was an environmentalist, and she had such a powerful reaction to his speech that this is exactly what she had to say. And I'll let you read this. So there are three significant things about this response. Number one, these two words had never been used before in the same combination when referring to Al Gore as a presenter. Am I right? The second one is that she had, in reference to this presentation, she talked about it as something that she had seen, not heard. So that to me says that the visual component of a presentation is incredibly powerful. The third thing is that she was going to tell everyone she knew about this particular presentation. So by reaching one person, this woman, Lori, was going to go out and tell everybody, and they were going to tell two friends, and so you're going to have this viral spreading of a message. Well, it just so happens that the people that she knows were very connected and very influential. You see, Lori's last name is David, and at the time she was married to a guy named Larry David, who you may know is the creator of both Seinfeld and one of my favorite shows, Curb Your Enthusiasm. Lori was also connected to a gentleman by the name of Davis Guggenheim, that Guggenheim family. But this Guggenheim didn't just rest on his family money. He became an award-winning documentary filmmaker. And so by going out and telling everybody she knew, it started this chain of events that ultimately resulted in this film. And in 2006, when Inconvenient Truth came out, it was so successful that it won 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Documentary Film, one for the Best Song. It garnered a Nobel Peace Prize for Al Gore. And then Nielsen, the research study company, did a survey of over 1,000 people in 47 different countries. And what they found out was that 66% of the people that saw this film had their mind changed about it. And then 89% became more aware of global warming and climate change as a result. And then an astounding 75% of those people polled said they were going to change some behavior to help mitigate the factors that were going on with climate change. So in my mind, this movie was really a catalyst or almost a symbol of this modern environmental movement that we have going on right now. All from a PowerPoint presentation? That's what this movie is. Yeah, so PowerPoint presentations are incredibly powerful. I'm going to use the term PowerPoint as a generic term, sort of like Kleenex or Band-Aid, because it's become sort of this descriptor of presentation software. And everything I'm going to talk about today is relevant for whatever presentation software you use. Al Gore happens to sit on the board of directors at Apple, so he created this presentation in Keynote, just as an aside. So I believe that you can make presentations that change the world. I mean, if Al Gore can do it, you can certainly do it too. In fact, I believe the only reason to give a presentation is to create change. You want to take your audience from where they are now to where you want them to go. So your presentation is this bridge that shortens that gap. I want to make presentations that change the world in terms of teaching people how to make better presentations because, as Rafi said, PowerPoint presentations are generally dreadful. Think back for a second on the last 1 or 2 PowerPoint presentations that you saw? And how many of them were outstanding? Probably not too many. So I'm here to save the day, as Rocky said. And so everything that I'm going to share with you today is going to be relevant for any type of presentation you make. And I'll get to that more about that in a moment. So this isn't new. This has been happening throughout history. And there's examples of a lot of really great presenters. Let me share some with you. Which one of these is not like the other? Yeah, maybe George isn't quite worthy of this here. So there's what's awesome in my opinion is there's this modern renaissance of the art of presenting and telling stories. And TED is a perfect example of this. How many of you have seen a TED speech? Yeah, almost everybody. It's a conference, it's a worldwide movement. They have thousands of speeches online. And they're translated into 83 different languages. Another example of this is the Pecha Kucha movement. Pecha Kucha is a format where about 10 presenters will speak throughout the evening. Each presenter gets 20 slides for 20 seconds each. So a total of 6 minutes and 40 seconds to tell a compelling presentation. It's happening in 455 cities around the world. And it's happening right here in San Diego. It's sponsored by the San Diego Architectural Foundation. And I've had the benefit of speaking at it twice and then emceeing several times. If you want to find out more, the executive director of the San Diego Architectural Foundation just stepped into the room, so you can talk to Leslie. So hopefully what you learned today might be applicable to this particular format. So yes, I think that presentations can change the world. But you might be saying, well, David, that's a little bit grandiose for what I had in mind. I don't necessarily want to change the entire world. I just want to change my world. Well, great. That's fine. But I would argue that by changing your world, you do change the bigger world. Because I think we're all connected. I have to confess, I come from Lecours. We're a little bit into sort of metaphysical and that sort of type of thinking. So that is my sort of leaning and suggestion. And so let's say maybe you're here because you want to make presentations just to win new business. Well, a lot of you are in pretty amazing businesses that by giving the presentation, you win the business so that your business can then go out and change the world. I mean, we've got people like Rafi, who introduced me, who is a PhD and executive director of Worm Free World, working to eradicate the parasitic worms throughout the world. We've got Whitney and Zach from DPR who are changing the way buildings are built. This is a perfect example, and they're going to give a tour afterward about that. We've got Michelle here from Ocean Studios who is changing the way kids learn and understand stories by not just looking at books, but taking the entire Dr. Seuss properties and translating them to the iPad and the iPhone. Drew Hubble is building amazing buildings that are energy efficient. So I could go out through the whole room because there's an incredible group of people here. And usually what I like to do is allow for self-introductions, but with 35 people here, it would take at least a half an hour. So I encourage you to try to get to know each other afterward or on the tour. So you just have to reach one person with your presentation. Al Gore was a perfect example of that. By reaching Lori David, she went and told 2 people, and then the message spread like wildfire. So just by following a few simple principles, you can elevate your game and elevate your level of presentations. And these things are timeless. Like I mentioned before, they're not dependent on any sort of software. So whether you're giving a webinar, whether you're giving a presentation like I'm doing now, whether you're giving a product demonstration, whether you're speaking at a conference, all these ways that anytime that you're combining visual with verbal, these timeless lessons that I'm going to share with you will be applicable. So I like to think of a presentation as like a 3-legged stool. And there's 3 main components to a really great presentation. Development, which means coming up with the content, writing your script. Design, which is designing the visuals that support that content that you've developed. And then finally, the delivery. And the delivery is game day. It's when you show up and it's when people get to hear and see what you have to talk about. Now, I think that it's a great strategy to tell a lot about a little, not a little about a lot. So all we're going to focus on is these three things. Now, if you were to be sitting on this stool and you were to lose one of the legs, where would you be? Yeah, not a real great place to be presenting from. So there's one sort of a component that's missing, and purposely, which is the software part of it. And whether you're presenting using PowerPoint or Keynote or Prezi or SlideRocket, all these principles that I'm going to talk about today are still relevant. But you definitely need to sort of pick one of those and get somewhat proficient in that. If you don't feel like you're comfortable in that area, a great resource to learn software is lynda.com, Linda.com. Really powerful video tutorials. I think they have a plan where you can have access to their entire library for like $29 for the entire month. I think that presenting about learning software is not only incredibly boring, but it's a terrible way to learn. I think to learn software needs to be kinesthetic learning. We're actually doing it, working on a real presentation, not just sitting and listening. So I've cut that out, and we're just going to focus on the meat and the most efficient and most effective points. All right, so let's get this party started. We're going to start out, first we've got to define the problem, what's wrong, and then I'm going to offer a solution about how I think you should fix it. Then we're going to talk about what I call the 3 Ds, development of content, design of the slides, and then delivery. And after each section, we're going to have a Q&A, so you're not going to have to remember your questions until the very end. And then we're going to do a reverse Q&A where I'm going to ask you guys questions, and you're going to have an opportunity to demonstrate your brilliance. And if you do, you're going to have an opportunity to win a prize. Yeah, you can move on. And then finally, we're going to wrap up. As an aside, a Q&A is a terrible way to end a presentation. And you see it all the time. The problem is that you have no control of the answers. You have no control over how the energy goes. And you want to leave people with your message and lead people on sort of an upward swing. So we're going to do a wrap-up at the end where I summarize what's been going on and send you off on your way. Hopefully, I'm going to demonstrate what I practice. I'm going to practice what I preach, and I'm going to be modeling the behavior that I hope you'll adapt. All right, so what's the problem? We have, it's been estimated, between 30 and 50 million PowerPoint presentations being given daily on this planet. PowerPoint has essentially become the de facto business communication tool that people use to communicate their ideas. But as we talked about, generally they're dreadful. They're just not compelling. And there's this epidemic. And so as a result, people tend to hate listening to PowerPoint presentations. And I want to share with you sort of a funny, goofy video that communicates what I'm talking about.
If I want to sleep, I'll go there. And if I want to read, I'll let this in my chair. And if I want to hear a monotonous drone, I'll ask a politician about free trade zones. And if I want charts, I'll read S&P. And if I want quotes, I'll tune in Carney or Jay-Z. You think I'm paying attention? Well, get inside my head. I feel it because I'm in the head. It's inhuman. It's a crime. It's so painful, I got a brain full. Hey, I'll throw you in the tube, because you're killing me with your PowerPoint. Now, I know you probably can't read this. Probably not at the front either, but I really like it.
Yeah, so if you search YouTube, there are dozens of these tribute videos to the perils of dreadful PowerPoint. But PowerPoint or Keynote or whatever, it's just a tool. Don't hate the tool, because it can be very powerful. So whether you're using PowerPoint or whether you're using Keynote, it is just a tool. And like a hammer can be used to build great carpentry or architecture or a building like this, it can also be used for destruction or demolition. So you get to choose how you're going to use this tool. So here's really the crux of the problem. As a leader, somebody that's giving presentations, you're expected to be able to deliver these presentations. But the reality is that most of us weren't trained to do this kind of thing. And so what happens is that perhaps an executive ends up saying, hey, asking their admin assistant to put this thing together, and neither one of them have been trained for it. Now, give me a show of hands. How many of you in the audience either went to art or design school? So this is actually significantly higher than usual. In fact, I need to rethink that question. Because it's supposed to be about 1 or 2 hands that go up. The rest of us are usually, I went to, had a sort of liberal arts education, and then I went to design school. And the majority of us, our education system is built on taking writing, English, composition. It's all about sort of the verbal language. Very few of us are actually trained in visual communication. So what happens when somebody who has not been trained in visual communication goes to create visual communication? They start stuffing it with verbal. And they put in what? Words and a bunch of bullet points. And there's no faster way to alienate and bore your audience than just sticking a bunch of words and bullets on a slide. Okay, so here's where we're headed. These 3 particular items. And we're going to start off with the development. The development is developing your content, coming up with your words, your script, or your outline. And this is this phase that is often quickly glossed over. And it's a huge mistake. We have this pull, this like gravitational attraction to get on the software and start making things happen. Because in our minds, we feel like that's progress. We feel like perhaps this development stage, which is the critical thinking stage, isn't as important. And so if we want to see progress, we jump on the software. And that's a terrible place to start. Giving a presentation is this unrivaled opportunity in which you have an audience like this, commercial-free, email distraction-free, and you have to come up with content that's going to engage them. And the only way to do that is to really think about what you're going to say and what your message and how the overall organization of the presentation is going to be. Because presentations in this particular format have a certain power of being multimedia. There's this ability to reach both hearts and minds if it's done well. And when you have many senses engaged, both verbal, visual, auditory, you have this ability to not only create a deeper emotional connection, but then also it increases the ability for your message to be remembered. And we're learning a lot about this in neuroscience. There's some fascinating studies happening that relate to this. Typically in an audience like today, we have people that are both verbal and visual. The beauty about this type of presentation is that you can reach everybody because certain people learn in certain ways. The other thing is that we can appeal to people that gravitate more towards the logical and those that appeal or gravitate more towards an emotional appeal. So again, this sort of multi-pronged approach reaches people on a deeper level. The other great thing about an experience like this is that it's communal. In other words, we're all experiencing this all together. Have any of you had an experience where you went to a movie and saw a film and it was incredibly funny or scary or emotional, but then when you watch that movie on video, it just didn't have the same appeal? Well, that's because the audience and that communal energy affects the way you perceive things. And so by experiencing this all together, there's an energy, there's an excitement that you can utilize in your presentations. The caveat to this is that there's high expectations. Anytime you have something on a screen, or anytime you start to dim the lights, we have somebody up in front of an audience like this, all of a sudden you as the audience are comparing me as the presenter to the last movie you saw, the last theater production you saw, the funniest comedian you saw. And so that's a kind of tall order. And I don't say this to intimidate you, but I say it to sort of motivate you during this phase of development to really think about what it is that you're going to say and the message that you're going to develop. All right, so point number one to the development side is that you are the star of the presentation. People come to see you and what you have to say. And it's not just information transfer. People want an experience. Hopefully there'll be some epiphanies, some things that go off in your head and go, yes, I've got to use that in my next presentation. And if you're not providing that, then just send people a PDF. Don't stand up here and waste everybody's time. So you're the star, not the slides. And that's a really hard distinction because we spend a lot of time creating really beautiful slides. And as a designer, graphic designer, I know that's hard for me. But the reality is that it's you standing up in front of the group. So here's how I think of a presentation. I think of it actually as a present. Within that word presentation is the word present. And it's a present that you bring to your audience. So while you're the star, I want you to think of your audience as the king. And I want you to think of your king or your audience that looks like this. And this is a dubious king. And that king is thinking to himself, why should I listen to you as the presenter? Why should I adopt your point of view? And hypothetically, if I do adopt your point of view, what are the steps that I take to help move whatever cause this is forward? And it's not your slides that are going to impress the king. It's you. You're the star. And if you don't perform, you're losing your head. Begin your planning of your development in analog. And again, I know this is hard because we live in such a digital world, and we equate progress and getting things done with getting on the computer and starting to go. But you can't do that first. You've got to start thinking about what the content is using simple tools, your brain, pen, paper, a whiteboard, stickies. Let me give you a strategy that I think is really effective that I've used to create presentations, and it looks like this. What you do is you start off with a stack of stickies. They don't need to be color-coded. I think that's even more distracting. And what you do is what I call a brain dump. You already are an expert in whatever you're talking about. So start with a stack of stickies and start getting everything out. The thing is that you want to use one sticky for one point that you're going to make during your talk, and write it down. Now, I would recommend starting with those small stickies that are about 2 by 2. And what this does is that it forces you to have an economy of words or pictures, because you want your slides to be pretty simple. So write down a note like, you are the star, and put that on a sticky, and then get all that out, and just put them anywhere. Then what you want to do is start looking at this big group of stickies and start to realize that there's actually some connections, and create a connection between those that sort of lump in the same group, and put those here. That's point number 1. Find another group, point number 2, and then another group, point number 3, or however many. I recommend about 3 points. For this, it's going to be development, design, delivery. Then realize, okay, well, I've got 20 points I'm going to make here, 20 here, and I've only got 3 here. Well, I probably need to fill in the gaps a little bit for this section. So maybe you need to do a little bit more research. And then what you can do is, all right, so that's sort of your loose presentation, but maybe there's another way to present this information. So you've got this wall of stickies. Get out your digital camera, take a picture of that, so you've got it saved, and then rework it. See if there's another way to tell that story. The best way to come up with a great idea is to come up with a bunch of ideas. So don't fall in love with your first idea. Try it in a new way so that you're pushing yourself to what actually could be. Take a picture of that, and then maybe compare how these stories are being told, and then decide on, okay, this is going to be the organization. And then from there, you're going to start to build slides that are representative of each little sticky. Does that make sense? There's a terrific book out there by Cliff Atkinson called Beyond Bullet Points, if you want to supplement your library about presentations. And he has a great quote in talking to this idea of not starting in digital, but thinking in analog and planning it out. He said, starting right in the software is like a movie director hiring a bunch of actors and starting to film before there's any script. And what a great waste of time and money that would be. The next point is that you want to develop content or words that are sort of like sound bites. Short, pithy, memorable phrases that people can not only take in and remember, but that they can then repeat and tell other people. So use catchy phrases that are memorable. A great sort of model for this is Twitter. In Twitter, you have to condense things to 140 characters to get your message across. And I'm not saying you need to make all your slides 140 characters. I would recommend that as efficiently and quickly as you can make your point, then do that on the slides. We don't want to read a bunch of words. We can read on our own. Do what I'm doing here. Sound bites are tasty. That's a quick little point that I'm making. Hopefully you'll remember it. Try not to use jargon when you're, because not everybody in the audience is going to know that. So just simple, clear, and it may seem, here's what happens when we're experts at things. Sometimes we feel like we have to demonstrate how smart we are, and when that starts to happen, things really break down. And so be overly simple and direct, because your audience needs to be able to take in and understand what you're talking about. So Gar Reynolds, this is another great book on this subject called Presentation Zen, and he makes a point between 3 different types of communication vehicles. One is the document, sort of like a white paper, a sea of text, right? At the other end of the spectrum is the presentation, what I'm doing now. But he says what happens is a lot of times these 2 things, which are on the opposite end, get hybridized into something that is really ineffective, which he calls a slidegement. So it's a document and a slideshow put into one. And you've sat through these, and they're not fun. This is when somebody puts a series of words up on the screen, and they read them to you. And the problem with that is that people can read twice as fast as you can speak. So if you're doing this, not only are you turning your back on the audience, which is not very appealing, but you're starting to read things that people have already read, and it goes downhill from there. Okay, so use tasty sound bites. I want to give you 2 examples from one of the people that I think is one of the most, or was unfortunately one of the most amazing presenters, and that's Steve Jobs. So let me show you what he did at Apple. They were introducing a new product. I want to say this was 2003, the iPod. And nobody had ever seen any sort of device like this. There wasn't it wasn't part of our whole world like it is now. And they were trying to communicate what is the sort of value proposition of this thing. Well, the way that they saw it is people could take these entire music collection of CDs or albums and condense it down into this one device. So they came up with this really tasty soundbite, which was this. And it perfectly communicates what the essence of this product is. And that sort of laser ability is what Apple was brilliant for. I just finished reading the Steve Jobs biography. And he was such a stickler, almost to the extreme of condensing these things down and editing out all the superfluous. And to me, that's what separates Apple from Microsoft. It's this incredible ability to edit and not give you everything that could be possible, but give you the juiciest parts that are really relevant. Here's another example. They're introducing the MacBook Air, an incredibly thin notebook. And during the launch, or the first time anybody had ever seen this particular product, he does it's theater. He comes out and creates this amazing experience where he walks out with his inner office envelope. The type, manila, it's got the drawstring on the closures. He unravels those, and then he pulls out this device. And people are just spellbound, because nobody's ever seen a notebook this small. So what's the tasty soundbite that they came up with? Bam! The world's thinnest notebook. So these are the types of combinations of both words and pictures that you want to incorporate. Another thing you might want to consider is this power of 3. And I don't know exactly where this comes from. Maybe it's the Holy Trinity. But things just sound better and they're more memorable when you cluster them in 3s. Does anybody actually have any knowledge about why 3s work so much better? I don't know if it comes from poetry. Or it's just, I guess we need somebody who's like a numerologist. But yeah, so today I'm modeling behavior I want you to adopt: development, delivery, and design. 3 Ds. When you can organize content or examples in the power of 3, there's this rhythm, there's this memorability, and it's a great device to use. The other thing that is really powerful as you develop your content is to utilize the power of story. Nobody likes to be sold, but we love to hear stories. In fact, I think stories are primal. If you look at kids, and anybody have kids? Were any of you kids? Yeah, I think some of us are still kids. We love to hear stories, and just right out of the box, it's something that we enjoy. And it's such a powerful way to communicate a presentation. I had the benefit of, let me talk a little bit more about some things you should incorporate in stories. Tell them as if they're actually happening in real time is a technique that you should use. Add specificity, use real names, real places, real descriptions of what's happening in that particular story, and make it personal. Again, you're up here, you're the star. People want to know what you believe. To be an effective presenter, you have this ability to move somebody along this continuum of getting to know you, to getting to like you, to getting to trust you. And stories are an incredible way to fast track that particular process. So tell personal stories and make yourself vulnerable. You don't have to be perfect, you don't have to be an expert. And this has been a really tough lesson for me because, like probably a lot of people in this room, I suffer from perfectionism, trying to get everything right, trying to do it perfectly. But the reality is that what's going to move somebody across the spectrum of getting to know, to like, to trust you is when you make yourself human, when you open up and show your vulnerabilities. I had the benefit of speaking at one of the TEDx here last May, and actually the title of my presentation or speech was The Power of Story. And I started off with a story about Gandhi. And I would say pretty much everyone in this room probably has heard this quote, but how many of you know the story behind the quote? All right, well, I'm going to tell it to you. So, a woman and her son came to see Gandhi, and she asked Gandhi, "Gandhiji, please tell my son to stop eating sweets. He is not healthy." Gandhi said, "Come back in 3 days, and I will speak with your boy." The woman was confused. She and her boy walked several miles back to their village, waited the 3 days, and then returned. So she comes back, says, "Okay, we're back. Please talk to my boy." And Gandhi says, "Stop eating sweets. They are not good for you." Again, the woman is like, "Really?" Okay, they didn't use that kind of terminology back then, but why did you ask us to leave for 3 days and then come back? Could you not have told my son this advice when we were first here? Gandhi said, "I could not tell your son to stop eating sweets then because I too have a problem eating sweets. I could not ask somebody to do something that I was not willing to do myself." So that's the power of story. And that's where we get, be the change that you want to see in the world. So I'm sure there's areas in your life where you want to see change. And the best way to start making that happen is to look at yourself, look in the mirror. And you've got to start modeling that behavior or else it's never going to happen. So yeah, I think stories are an incredibly powerful way to make points because they model the behavior that you want your audience to adopt. And it's kind of like a Trojan horse, in that inside that Trojan horse is your message. But people become so enwrapped in the story that they lean forward, they become adopted, they don't feel like they're being sold to or trying to be persuaded or manipulated. They like the story, and hopefully there's a message in there. And then what happens is that they think they're so smart that they've seen the message in there, and when people are thinking of their own ideas, like they're the ones that get it, then they're much more apt to adopt your grand idea. Here's a great quote. "I believe in the power of story to change an audience, and then that audience has the power to go and change the world." Nancy Duarte owns a firm up in Northern California called Duarte, and she wrote a book called Slidology that is a fantastic guide to presentations. All right, so let's review what we're talking about here, which is the development phase of a presentation. You want to harness the power of multimedia. You are the star of the presentation. Begin planning in analog, using paper and pencil and coming up with your ideas, and you're using stickies. When you're coming up with the words, make them short, memorable. Sound bites are, of course, tasty. You can utilize both the power of 3 and the power of story. All right, so here's where it gets fun. This is where we're going to do the free prize. So let me tell you about this prize that you're going to have an opportunity to win. I spent 15 years living in Los Angeles, went to undergrad and then design school up there. And this is a book that I designed, I photographed, and I wrote called Positive Space. And it's sort of a game where you look at these icons of LA, and it's a fill-in-the-blank kind of thing. Don't worry, the answers are in the back. So I'm going to ask some questions. I'm going to try to be objective. And if you know the answer to this question, raise your hand. I'll call on you. And then you have the opportunity to win this book. And happy to stay around after and sign your book if that you think will add value. All right? Okay, so who can tell me why might we use stickies in developing our presentation? Lori.
Do I need to stand up?
However you feel more comfortable.
I don't want to take your thunder. So I think that the reason that we're going to use small stickies is so that we have to become concise in our thinking and what we're going to write down.
Exactly. You win! Woo! Come on down. Yeah, not only do you have to be concise, but there's something sort of impermanent about a sticky that allows you to move ideas around quickly. When you start creating in the software, you get really attached to your slides, and it's really tough to edit them. All right, question number 2. What are sound bites, and why do we want to use them in a presentation? Anyone? Yes, Beth.
Sound bites can help you convey your message in a meaningful way to your audience. It's small.
It's condensed, right. So not only can you do it to your message, but to your audience, but hopefully then your audience can also tell that story to other people. You win also. And who can tell me why should we use stories in our presentation? Rafi.
Well, stories draw people in. They're, without selling somebody directly, it makes you more human, personable to them, so that eventually they'll trust you. They know you, get to know you, like you, and trust you. So stories do that.
Perfect. You win! All right, so I've asked questions. Did any of you have any questions about this phase of the process, which is the development of your content? Coming up with ideas, organizing them. Yes, Ravi.
Sorry. See, the question I have, and is that the way you are using PowerPoint is, as you said, sound bites. There are hardly bullets, and it's very different than, the corporate world that I grew up in. So on one hand, I'm getting the message, but I'm finding that there's a lot of things to unlearn in this process.
Right.
And I'm uncomfortable.
Sure.
So my question is basically, how do I wade through this?
Right. So yeah, I think anytime we have to change, it gets uncomfortable. We like what we know, and you're right. The corporate world is full of what I consider to be bad PowerPoint, and people dread listening to it. People don't spend the time to prepare. They do a data dump. They throw everything in. They throw a bunch of words in. And that's my mission, is to help try to change that. Sometimes maybe it takes baby steps. Throwing out your entire presentation, if you've got one due the next week, is probably not a realistic use of your time. But I think maybe throwing away a quarter of it and refining those slides, and then just kind of keep tweaking and refining. I love the Japanese principle of Kaizen, which is this idea of continual improvement. And you try something, you get feedback, you fine-tune it, and then you make it better and better and better. So yeah, it's not going to happen overnight, but it can happen. Drew.
In your experience, we have a lot of visuals, so when I give a presentation, it's almost all projects or examples. Is there a balance? Should you have some words in there, or lead items?
There isn't a formula. I think it, of course, depends on who your audience is, and then really critically, what are you trying to accomplish? Where are you trying to take them? Where's here and where's there? And what's going to be the most efficient way? If you can pull it off and just show an entire presentation versus visuals, and you're providing the verbal, I think that's fantastic. But a lot of times we can't do that, so we have to incorporate both. I just think in both cases, whether you're showing visuals or you're showing words, it should be condensed. It should be simple. Kurt.
A lot of times in presentations, I have a memory problem. And there are a lot of points I want to get out. And how do you decide, prioritize, what are the best points?
Yeah.
Because, sometimes the client you've never met.
Sure.
So you really want to get a lot on the table, but then you have to still
Right.
slice and dice it up to make it work right.
Yeah, I think doing as much research as you can about your audience. You know, I have a pretty good sense of who is going to be here. I asked what your name and profession was. Sometimes you're right, you don't have that luxury. You can try to get a sense of who you're going to be presenting to. It's really hard to edit. In fact, I think it's really good to help because we fall in love with our ideas, and we love all our sort of creative offspring equally, and to cut them off is really difficult. I hate it. I have an amazing wife, and she helps me to edit and tells me, you know, David, that just doesn't make sense here. I know you're attached to it and you dig it, but it's got to go. And so having somebody else that can help you edit can be really a good way to do it. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Yes, Will.
Well, I always started out doing it all in words, and then I would get it down to almost a few words, and then I think if I was really good, I could get it down to all pictures. And that's kind of what you're doing here, more or less. But one thing you've done is this, because when I'm a participant and listening, I feel kind of like uneasy that the data is not on the screen. And I want to take those slides if I'm working, and I want to have that data if I need to read, get to it. So if it's just all verbal, you know, it's all less than I have to do a lot of work.
Yeah.
Right? I have to sit there and listen and write it all down, that kind of stuff. But you solve that by this.
Yeah.
Are you going to talk about this at all?
I am. Yeah. I did it on purpose. Yes.
Question of, so far you've talked about the development of the message, all little packages, little post-it notes.
Right.
How do you develop, and maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but the continuity or the string,
Yeah.
themes and all of that?
Sort of the flow, right. In clustering those notes together, the good thing about seeing them in total, you know, the gestalt of the whole thing is being able to look at all these things together. This is why going to digital is a terrible idea. You can only look at sort of one slide at a time, or maybe you get that bar on the side that shows little thumbnails, but you only see like 9 of them that fit within the screen size. You can't see the whole thing, but having the Post-its on there, you can see the whole thing, and you can start to sort of, I think it's more of an intuitive thing. I don't think there's a sort of formula or logic to it. I think it's just sort of what feels, some things are sequential in terms of chronology, and of course you want to, you know, in terms of a timeline, you want to put this first, or some things build on other concepts, and so that's going to help you kind of make those decisions. All right, so we got a lot to do. There's going to be plenty more time to answer questions. We're going to move into the next phase of presentations, which is the design part of it. And a key point that I want to make here is that less is more. I want you to think about your slides, as you're designing the slides, as a billboard. And the billboard, in the advertising world, we have this 3-second rule. And what that says is that if you're driving by in a car, and if you can't both read and comprehend the message within 3 seconds, then that billboard design has absolutely failed. And I think the same is true for your slides. So what I want you to do is incorporate this idea of maximum signal, minimal noise in your slide presentation. Because if you have a bunch of stuff going on that's sort of decoration, then it competes with your sort of core message. The other thing is that I, right now, am competing with all the noise in all of your heads. And you're thinking about, did you leave the toaster on? Do I have enough cat food? Am I going to have enough money to pay the mortgage? What am I going to do tonight? It's date night. My wife wants to go out. She loves movies. I hate plays. Blah, 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 blah. So you have got to have a message that is solid, it's concise, again, and the maximum signal to noise. If you have multiple points that you're trying to make, have multiple slides. You don't need to stick 5 points on one slide when you can have 5 different slides that focus everybody's attention. Because when you have 5 points on a slide, people are reading all 5 of those and not focusing on the one that you want to talk about. Visually, or a design principle that you can incorporate, and a great one that I endorse, is this idea of white space. White space is blank space, or what we call negative space, that happens around images. This is a business card of a guy I know, and what it does, I think, effectively is it uses white space that is a nice pause, you know, a breath. So then when you get hit with the sort of the visual icon here or the type, it helps you focus on that particular imagery. Rather than having a bunch of noise going on competing, you want to guide visually, you want to sort of guide your viewer through your piece, and white space provides the space around to do that. I heard a great quote about music isn't actually the notes, it's the space between the notes that makes the music. And I think the same is true for visual design. I alluded to this book earlier, Nancy Duarte. If you buy one book about presentation design, this is the one. It's really fantastic. Her company designed the presentation that Al Gore used in An Inconvenient Truth. Here's how she organizes the design, and I really couldn't improve upon this, so I borrowed it from her. And a good slide design is made up of a background. It incorporates color. It might involve text or images or a combination of both. So where do you start? Well, I think you should start with color. Color has this emotional, strong thing. It's probably the first thing that people notice, whether they're conscious of it or not. Evokes a feeling. And so what color do you put on there? Well, again, it's sort of knowing, back to sort of Kurt's question, knowing your audience. Who is your king? Who is your audience, and what do they think and what you want them to think? Do you want them to get excited? Or do you want to sort of pacify or create a sense of peace? And those are the color decisions that you want to make. Look, there's a reason that this color palette is used for every single fast food restaurant on the planet. McDonald's, Carl's Jr., Burger King, In-N-Out Burger. Because we know that, well, on a sort of metaphorical level, this represents ketchup and mustard. Red also elevates hunger. And there have been all sorts of tests to document that. So think about what you're trying to do and develop a color palette that supports your message. So let's do a little color theory 101. This is the color wheel. And a great strategy for coming up with color palettes that work well is this idea of complementary contrast. Complementary contrast is taking two colors that are at opposite ends of the color wheel and using them together. One is that this creates a maximum amount of contrast, because what you're seeing on your screen is never going to be what's projected on this screen. Colors are always going to be more muted because the power of the projectors, and these are fantastic ones, but they always dilute or diffuse the color a little bit. So you want to make sure you have a maximum amount of contrast. This isn't the time to sort of do subtle gradation shifts in your slides if you want things to be readable and noticeable. So this can move across so anytime you have colors on the opposite sides, you're doing a good job of creating colors that will work really well. The other thing is you're going to have varying projectors, you're going to have varying light levels. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to delivery, but go for maximum contrast. The other thing you might consider is sort of warm colors versus cool. I've divided the color wheel or spectrum here in half. Cool colors have a tendency to recede. So they're great to use for backgrounds. Warm colors have this ability to sort of come forward. So of course they're really great for using in foregrounds. So what if you are still sort of color challenged and you want some ideas or places to go? Well, I'm going to give you some real practical suggestions because I want all this to be real turnkey for you. This is a great site called Color Lovers, spelled like the British incorrectly spell the word. .com. And what they do is they take real popular websites and they break down the website into the color palettes. And then you can go in and take these swatches and look at the sort of number makeup, whether it's RGB or CMYK, and borrow these color palettes. And that's a great starting point, or at least place that you can adopt color from there. Another great resource is this site. This is a blogger, and her site is called Design Seeds. And what she's done is taken really intriguing imagery and taking, those of you familiar with Photoshop, the eyedropper, and picking key colors within the photograph and coming up with these beautiful color palettes that are taken from there. Here's another example of that. Something also to consider is where you're going to actually be presenting. If you're going to be presenting in a dark room or a light room. Let me give you an example. When I was speaking at TEDx, it was a dark room. The slides were really well lit, and I, as the speaker, was lit only through a spotlight. Everything else was really dark. So in this case, white or light type on a dark background looks really well because it looks like the type is just sort of floating in the entire space. If you're in a light room, which is kind of what we're going on here, I would err probably more on the white background and the dark type. I've got a mix in here because we did a test the other day, and I knew that the projectors were really good. But if you don't know where you're going to be presenting, or if you don't know exactly how everything's going to work, think a little bit about, is it dark or light? And then it sort of reduces your decision making just to sort of one or the other. So let's talk a bit about composition. And composition is just sort of the arrangement of elements on a slide. And we're going to start with this. How many of you have iPhones? Yep, and how many of you have seen this function when you want to take pictures? And any of you sort of wonder, what the hell is this thing? All right, good. Well, I'll try to dispel that. This is what we call the rule of thirds. And the rule of thirds is borrowed from photography. And what it does is it takes any sort of composition and divides it into threes by using these grid lines. And by having these on there, if you arrange your elements effectively, it can create more tension, more interest, more energy in your composition. So let me give you an example. We'll play a little game here. I'm going to show you two images, and I want you to tell me which you think is more compelling. Number one or number two? Number one or number two? All right, most of you are saying two, which is good because that's the correct answer. And here's why. What's happening here is if you divide it up into thirds, I put the horizon line right there along this particular lower grid line. There's also another thing that happens along the intersection of lines, and I put this sort of very strong visual element right here at the intersection. The other thing you can do is, let's say you're starting to add text to your slides. A great strategy there is to line up the text along this grid line. So now you've got a nice line that's happening along the horizon. You've got also a place to put that, and then it starts to work really effectively. This can also work for vertical pictures. You take a vertical picture, and again, you divide it into threes. And again, this works particularly well because, again, the horizon line is set nicely along this line. And so what it does is it allows the viewer to, rather have to sort of, like in a 50-50 kind of composition, it's too much for the audience to sort of decide, or having that sort of extreme balance is a little bit dull. This creates a little more energy and a little more tension. So there's another thing that happens, again, at these sort of intersections of these things. And there's actually a technical term for this. Does anybody know what it is? These points that happen at the intersection? Well, interestingly enough, they're called power points. So maybe, in their brilliance, this is where Microsoft came up with this name. All right, so let me show an example of how this works. Here's a shot that I took hiking in Hawaii. It's all right. I think this is a little bit more compelling by setting it off on the side. And so here's why. This happens, this sort of very strong visual element is set up right at one of these particular power points. All right, so let's talk about horizontal versus vertical. You can incorporate either. I think that horizontal works a lot better because that's the aspect ratio of the screen that you're working with. But sometimes you're going to have a vertical image that is to make a point or is just really outstanding. So let me show you an example of kind of the same shot, horizontal, vertical. Yeah, real quickly, you can see the problem with vertical is that to get the entire thing within the frame of this screen, you have to sacrifice size. And so, in my mind, this is so much more impactful. Don't be afraid to let your images bleed. Bleed is a graphic arts and photography term of letting the image actually go to the edge of your slide. I think this works because it feels like it's immersing you in. Compare that to this, where I have this black, well, you can't really see the frame because the screen's black. But anyway, I don't think there's any reason to add a frame. I think it's sort of superfluous noise, and you want to be all about signal. You don't have to have your image bleed off all four sides. You could create some sort of dynamic layout by having it just bleed off of three of the sides and then add some interesting text. This is shot at the Huntington Gardens. These are these succulents that I think are amazing called lithops that look like rocks. So symmetry is something you want to consider in your design layout. And there's really, well, there's a lot of different ways you can do this, but let's talk about two. The first of which is symmetrical, bisymmetry. In other words, what's shown on the left is pretty much what's equal on the right. If you're trying to communicate stability, solid, established, well, then you can probably do no better than this particular layout. And there's no mistake that this is why the sort of symbol or seal of our nation is done in this particular manner. If you're trying to create something a little more dynamic, then something like this showing asymmetry works really well. There's a nice diagonal in that your eye is sort of gone through here, and then there's, like I said, a diagonal down to the quote and the subtle image back behind here. My recommendation is that as you're designing your slides, if you're pressed for time, go ahead and use the templates or the backgrounds or the formats that are already set up within the software. But if this is a presentation that's really high stakes, that you're going to be giving a lot, that you really want to make a strong impression, avoid the templates. Yes, I know it's easy to get sucked into these, but the problem is that you start to see these over and over and over, and they become these visual cliches. And somebody puts their slide up there, and the whole audience just kind of goes, oh, I've seen this movie before. So I have a little movie clip that helps me to communicate this point.
It all starts with Windows 7 PC.
Yeah, she had seen that template before, and it doesn't work. So go for novelty. Create something fresh, something original, something that's going to surprise and delight the audience. I think these frames, some of these things that you can get online are just noise, and sort of like a piece of fine art. If all you notice is the frame, then the frame has absolutely failed the art. The frame should support and enhance the art, not distract from it. Something like this, in fact, takes so much sort of noise and space around the outside that this is the only area of usable space that you have within it. Don't be afraid to mix up your background, even within the same presentation. A strategy that I've used for this presentation is that my introduction has sort of more gray background, conclusion the same, but each section, each sort of main point has a different background. You may not notice this, but it's this sort of subtle visual cue that helps you realize, okay, now we're moving to another chapter, and now we're moving to another chapter. So that's a really good strategy that you can use. Now, I have a pet peeve about title slides, the first slide that is shown up, and sort of an ending slide. I think they should bookend, first of all. The other thing is I think that this is sort of the maximum amount of content that you should put. You should have the name of your presentation. You can have your logo. Who's doing the presenting? In today's environments, a lot of people are using Twitter, and especially at conferences, live tweeting your content. So I always include my Twitter handle. And then this was a presentation that I gave at Del Mar Toastmasters, so I include who is sponsoring that, in that case, the presentation. In my opinion, this is the only place your logo should show up. And this, like Ravi said, this is counter to what happens in the business world. There are these templates that your company gives you, and on every single slide is some sort of header with some sort of whoosh, flashy thingy, and then your logo. And I think that a logo should be somewhat more sacred. As a designer of corporate identities in my day job, I think that a logo needs to be this special seal that doesn't show up on every single slide because it starts to dilute the power of it. People get bored and sort of sick of it, and it's just not relevant, and it takes away from your message and what you're trying to say. In fact, a lot of the conferences that I'm speaking at now, there are specific guidelines that the organizers say the only place you can have your logo is on the beginning slide and the ending slide. In fact, they demand to see your slides before you present, and will potentially ask you not to speak. So that's my thought. You might think differently, but I think that's a professional way to do it, and it's a way to sort of preserve integrity of your logo and your message, what you're trying to make. Along this lines, there's this concept. There's a Yale University professor named Edward Tufte, and he's written a series of books. The most famous one is called The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And this guy is sort of the grandfather of this modern movement that we have happening in information graphics. Information graphics are the things that you would see like maybe on a USA Today, where it's some sort of complex idea that's been communicated in some sort of visual way. And he really advocates for this idea of minimizing what he calls chart junk. And chart junk is all the stuff around your data or things that you think makes it look more appealing, but really in reality does not. So I have another short clip to sort of communicate what I'm talking about here. So this is an awesome ad. It's really cute. It's really funny. But I think this kid has done his dad a huge disservice. Because unless you're presenting to 11-year-old boys, leave the explosions and the crazy 3D effects out. It just is not real solid. Let me contrast that with how my guru, Steve Jobs, would present data.
If you kind of make a business school 101 graph with a smart axis and the easy to use axis, phones, regular cell phones are kind of right there. They're not so smart and they're not so easy to use. But smartphones are definitely a little smarter, but they actually are harder to use. They're really complicated. Just for the basic stuff, people have a hard time figuring out how to use them. Well, we don't want to do either one of these things. What we want to do is make a leapfrog product that is way smarter than any mobile device has ever been and super easy to use. This is what iPhone is. Okay?
So yeah, I mean, he's using a little animation, things appear, but there's no explosions, there's no crazy 3D effects, drop shadows, reflections, all this stuff. I think if you're going to display data, that data needs to be interesting enough on its own. The sort of meaning behind that data. You shouldn't have to, add lipstick to a pig, right? It should just be really beautiful, in its simplicity. Da Vinci said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. All right, let's switch gears, talk about typography. Typography is sort of a fancy way of talking about choosing fonts and arranging those fonts on the page. And your typography needs to be consistent with the tone that you are speaking with and presenting with, and who your message is. So I'm going to talk about sort of the sort of different classifications of type and what they tend to mean in terms of, yeah, you'll get it. Serif is referring to the element at the end of the letter form, and it tends to communicate this idea of classic. This is why you see something like a newspaper. Times New Roman comes from the fact that Times New Roman was designed specifically for the London Times. So it has this very classic, very factual kind of connotation. Contrast that with sans serif, of course, without, has a much more modern, if you're a modernist, this is kind of where you want to go. Less decoration, real direct, real straightforward. Slab serif is a style that's sort of real popular these days. It has this sort of folksy, approachable. Interestingly enough, I have a friend who's working on the Obama 2012 campaign. I know he's got a little work to do. And they've changed their sort of identity from sans serif to the slab serif. You see the Obama 2012, they've picked a custom typeface that incorporates. The slab means it has this sort of like very slabbed or right angle kind of approach because he wants to feel more approachable, more folksy. Script, of course, communicates this idea of fancy, simulates handwriting. Period is a typography that represents a particular time or place. So what does this kind of evoke to you when I use that sort of typeface? Anyone? Prison, yeah, war. It feels like one of the stencils that would be spray painted. It has this very kind of construction, sort of like box kind of raw feel. This typeface down here, just don't ever use it. It's called Comic Sans. There's this whole movement going on. If you do Comic Sans and search on the Google, there's some hilarious stuff out there. Just a real quick story. LeBron James, when he decided to leave the Cleveland Cavaliers and go to the Miami Heat, the owner of the Cavaliers sent him this scathing, nasty letter that was, I think, published in several of the major newspapers. The problem was, he set the entire letter in Comic Sans, totally negating the effect that it was supposed to have. All right, so really, I think for presentations, you're probably going to choose between either serif or sans serif. And they can be used in combination. I'm using two of typefaces here that work well together. The sans serif is called Interstate. It's actually a typeface that was designed for the road signage. So it's real readable from a distance. The second one I'm using is Adobe Garamond, just because I think it's the most beautiful sans serif or serif typeface that was designed like in the 1600s. So I like that sort of mix of classic and old, and they work well together. Those type nerds like me will appreciate this little joke. Yeah. So type itself can actually be an image. And don't sort of negate the sort of potential that type itself has. If you have beautiful typography, and real quickly you know what this brand is because the typography is very identifiable. But I think not only that, it's beautiful to look at. I would recommend minimizing the number of fonts that you use. Unless you're trying to create this idea of a ransom note, limit it to 2. Maybe even just 1. Because people need to be able to get it. They want to have to sort of recalibrate their sort of brain. We want to keep it within that 3 seconds. So not only, of course, great looking type, fewer typefaces, but less words. Now, the way you set the type and some of the treatment that you can do can change the meaning. We're going to do a little call and response here. Tell me what this says.
You can change it.
Tell me what this says.
You.
Yeah.
You can.
And this?
Change it.
And this? Change it. Right. All right. So there's all different devices. You can use italics. You can change with color. You can change with this is the bold versus the thin. And you can change with size. So 4 or 5 different techniques that can totally change the meaning of what you're trying to say. So that's good typography, is communicating your message. What you should never do is this. Don't underline type. This is amateur typography 101. Unless you have some sort of like scientific notation or bibliography that mandates that you do this. The problem with this is that if you have a beautiful letter form like this G and the descender extends down below, it gets hacked. And it's just a visually disruptive and annoying way. So I would say never underline type. Use those other techniques, bold, color, italicize, if you want to create emphasis, not underline. You have not seen a bullet point in this entire presentation until now, and I'm telling you to avoid them because I think they are disruptive, they're annoying, and they're not necessary. You could very easily communicate this with just these 2 words. Some of you I know are not going to listen to me, and I've accounted for that. Here's what you do, all right? So let's say you're going to have a sentence, which I think you should have 1 slide per point, but again, some of you are going to be your own boss. And so this is how you should use this concept called builds. And builds are introducing information sequentially so that you're talking about something and making your point, and then you introduce the next thing. You talk about that, then you make the next point, and then you make the next point. If you stick let's imagine that these weren't just words, but they were entire sentences. You stick them all on the page, and that people are going to start reading the whole thing, and they're going to be way ahead of where you are verbally. And that creates tension and a disconnect, and you're going to start to lose your audience. We're going to talk about photography and how to use that in image. Photography is incredibly powerful. It's emotional. The old quote, "It's worth 1,000 words," definitely rings true. So the question is where do you get images to use in your slides? And again, I want to leave you with sort of practical, actionable information that you can take back with to your offices to create your next presentation. There are several different ways. The first of which is that you shoot it yourself. We all have these pretty great devices that can shoot 4 to 8 megapixels right in our camera, in our smartphones. So the quality, of course, is dependent on your skill as a photographer, but you have total control over what you're shooting, and the only cost is your time. So we're going to move up the scale in terms of complexity and cost. The next way you can get images is go to a website, something like Corbis.com or iStock Photo. This is called royalty-free, meaning that once you buy the image, you can use it however you like. The quality is good. You don't have much control. In other words, what you see is what you get. If you have an image of a woman with a blue hat and your color palette is all about reds, and that really irks you, then you're not going to be able to use that image very well. Cost is relatively inexpensive. The next notch up now notice I'm using builds here, I'm not throwing all this information at once, right, is rights managed. Rights managed is essentially like stock, except that instead of paying for it and owning it, you pay and you license that image for a particular usage. Say, I'm going to use this for a brochure, this particular print run, for this period of time. The benefit of this is it tends to be better quality imagery, but the cost is in line with that increased quality. And then, of course, the best solution, but also probably the most expensive, is custom. Hire a professional photographer like Chris Giles to go out and shoot. I say you have partial control in that you're somewhat subject to the whims of that photographer. You can go and art direct that photo shoot if you want, but this tends to cost the most. So these are sort of 4 different ways that you can gather imagery to use as backgrounds or for your particular presentation. Don't be afraid to combine more than one image on a page. I did that here to great comedic effect. And when you juxtapose things together, you can tend to create more meaning. This has a long history as well. In the art world, we have combining 2 things together. We call that a diptych, or 3 things together. It's a triptych. And you can create new meaning by combining things together. The caveat to that is that if you put a whole bunch of slide or imagery on one particular slide, it diminishes the impact. Of course, it increases the noise and reduces the signal. The other sort of thing you never want to do is stretch, enlarge, basically ruin sacred imagery, or any imagery for that matter. So when you see slides that have something like this because you want it to fit to both sides, resist that ridiculous impulse, okay? Just let it go. So don't stretch things horizontally, don't stretch them vertically, and if it's not a high enough resolution photo, just don't use it. Find one that is. There's nothing that sort of says amateur or I don't care about my presentation than trying to blow something up and you see all the pixels. I'm not going to get too far into the technical point, but if you want a rule of thumb, you're going to be presenting at a minimum of 800 by 600 pixels. This presentation is 1024 by 768. So if the starting image is less than that, you're never going to be able to compensate for that. So try to find something else or don't use it. Let me show you an example of some great visual aids.
Is going to reinvent the phone. And here it is. Now, actually, here.
So the beauty of showing photographic images is that you can show complex ideas in real time. In other words, everybody gets to experience the same visual at once. That's why everybody laughed when he showed this sort of visual joke. This was when the iPhone was being introduced and everybody thought, oh, they're just going to take the iPod user interface and stick a rotary dial on there. I think that's funny. So the beauty of experiencing it in real time is that everyone sees it and gets the joke, whereas if I had a visual aid and I gave it to somebody and it was passed out, by the time it got to the back corner, it would be 10 minutes later and I'd be talking about something totally different. So photography has this ability to communicate realism. Of course, you can manipulate that realism, and that's why this is funny. So imagery has a great ability to sort of be introduced as sort of comic timing in this case. And next I want to talk about a concept of combining type and imagery. And this, to me, is where things get really juicy. Imagery itself can be incredibly powerful. Type itself, when used together, it can be even more powerful. That's not happening here because of a thing that we call in the advertising world see-say. And see-say is essentially what you say is exactly the same as what you see. A better way to say this is, we all know that this picture is Steve Jobs. The type is adding no new meaning. So let me give you a comparison where adding type would add a whole nother level of meaning. When we do something like this, yeah, now this is powerful. This adds a whole nother level of meaning because we just lost Steve Jobs to cancer. So ideally, type plus image, 1 plus 1 should equal more than the mere sum of the parts. It should equal 3, not just 2. All right, so here we're going to have a little audience participation. We're going to play a game where I'm going to show an image. There's going to be a line at the bottom. And what I want you to do is in the notes section on the back is write down something that you think would add additional level of meaning. And let me be clear, you're going to be really tempted to just describe what you see, don't just add a caption. In other words, don't just add what you see here. Write down something that you think adds a new level of meaning, okay? So here's the first image. You know, if you're trying to make a point and you use this image, what point might you be trying to make? Yeah, okay, so now Robert is always ahead of the class. We're going to move to the next section. Does anybody want to share? Leslie?
Or don't get dogged down.
A what?
Don't get dogged down.
Don't get dogged down. Dig it, yeah.
Live naturally.
Live naturally. Yeah, don't sort of force crazy costumes on your pet. Michael?
Tired of walking your dog?
Nice. I love that. Yep.
Protect yourself.
Let's be creative.
Yeah, it's totally about creativity.
Stop animal testing.
Right. Right. Okay, so let's play this game again with a new image. And this time just raise your hand. I won't force you to write them down. If it helps, it's a llama. Yeah. Yeah, there you go. Right. Yeah, if he could do it, so can you. Make friends with your pet. Anybody else?
Surf safely.
Have a house full.
Yeah, home is where the heart is, or bike is.
There's no place like home.
Yeah, dig it. All right, so you get to the point. You get the point. Combining type with image can be really, really powerful. But there's other things just than photography. We can use things like illustration, and don't be afraid to use illustration. So here's the difference. Photography is very much about realism. Photography communicates this specific boy and this specific dog. But let's say you're presenting to a group of people that aren't this same ethnicity, or don't have this particular dog. Well, illustration is really fantastic for something like that, because it helps draw you in and it becomes more of a symbol. This becomes more about a generic boy and a generic dog. Perfect example of this is why illustration is so successful in children's books. Children identify with the characters that are being drawn in the picture, in the story. If it was a photograph, it would be very specific about that particular thing, rather than an icon representing, oh, that kid could be me, and it draws us in. There's illustration sites that are available in terms of getting illustration. You can hire illustrators. Another technique is sort of a hybrid between photography and illustration, which is like using things in silhouette. This takes a photograph but makes it more like an illustration because you don't see all the features of the person. It's not about this specific person, but now this could be really used effectively for communicating nature or beauty or, I don't know, butterflies, or, something, and it's not, you don't get sort of sucked in about like it's that specific person. Illustration has a huge history of being used, as a really powerful medium for creating change. You don't need too many words on that slide. And it doesn't have to be drawn. There's really amazing illustration happening like in the three-dimensional world. This is an illustrator that makes illustrations out of toilet paper tubes. So very creative. If a picture is worth 1,000 words or a photo is worth 1,000 words, I think video can be worth 10,000. I've been showing video today. I think it can be really powerful. And it's just a great way to communicate the essence, especially if you want to show realism or if you want to show a demonstration, then it can be really well. So let's review the visual part of designing your slides. I think you should incorporate less, and it can end up being more. I think you should start designing your slides thinking about color. Composition is the layout or the arrangement of elements on the slide. I recommend avoiding templates, avoid chart junk. Think about the typography, consider how you typeset the fonts you use. We know that a picture is worth a lot. We know that illustration works really well, and that video can too. All right, we're back to the free prize section. So we're going to ask some more questions. And the first question for a book is, who can tell me where you should begin your process of design? Robert.
Develop. Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, in relation to designing it, it's true you should begin developing, but color, yes. All right, you're going to have to pry this from Sherry. All right, well, I'll let you guys work that out. All right, someone want to explain to me the concept of signal to noise ratio? What should you have more of? Okay, yeah, that didn't work out so well in terms of getting out a prize. All right, so what do I mean? Raise of hand, please. What do I mean when I say typography is voice? If words are the message, if words are the content, typography is voice. What do I mean by that? Karen.
Well, the typography affects how you actually take the message in.
Exactly. Communicates the intent, and it is the tonality from which that content gets delivered.
I just want to say this table, everyone's won an award.
Whoa.
The rest of you have some catching up.
Thank you for setting the bar higher. Nice. All right, so any of you have questions about the design of the slides? Yes?
In typography, if your presentation is starting out kind of soft or subtle and building, is it appropriate to change typography along, just like you were showing your presentation of the color background?
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy. I think if you, again, it's sort of about what am I trying to communicate to whom and what's the best way to deliver that message. And if you have one section that takes on a totally different feel than the other sections, absolutely. It provides a little bit of variety. I think when it can be really jarring is if you have a bunch of type on one slide or if you're going from sort of slide to slide and changing the typography. But clustering it together, I think, is a fantastic idea.
I have to present a lot of scientific data, charts and things like that.
Yep.
And I was thinking about the grid thing that you talked about. Would you recommend having like a chart and then something around it describing it, or just filling the whole thing up with a chart?
If you're there to describe all those things that you would put around it, just the chart. You be the verbal. It's much more engaging to listen to a person than to read it. You may end up having to create two sets, one that you give sort of verbally and live, and in a lot of cases some people have to turn over their slides or pass them out. You end up, and I'm going to talk about this when we get to deliver, you end up creating a second set that has notes or something around it.
If we're trying to communicate with our audience, which is the objective,
Yeah.
don't engineers all identify the dots?
The bullets?
Yeah.
I don't think so. Yeah. Right. Just because somebody has bad behavior doesn't mean you need to reinforce it, right? Yes?
Using video. What's your trick? Because I see it fail again and again and again.
Yep, it failed yesterday when I came here to do the run-through. And I think that the key is to try it out on the actual equipment that you're going to be using. Whenever I can, mandate that I use my own system because I know it works. I'm not going to bring in my own projector, although I actually have one in the car if these were to fail. But I came here and I tested it and made sure it worked, and 2 of the videos didn't work. And I went back and I figured out that the way I'd saved the file wasn't compatible with the way it was going to work. Always have a backup plan. I've got the same video files. If it was really critical, I could leave Keynote and open up QuickTime or some other software and try to show the videos that way. But something is going to go wrong in your presentation, and you've just got to assume and just sort of be curious, like when it's going to happen, and then when it does happen, go, oh, that's when it went wrong. And I know this is hard because we get really attached, and I would have freaked if one thing didn't go wrong. But I've learned that you just kind of got to roll with it. Here's the deal. Your audience doesn't know what they're missing. So you just keep going, and they don't know only you know. So there's no kind of like silver bullet. Test it, test it, test it, test it in the environment, test it on your different machines, and try to figure it out. I think it's great when it's seamless. I think it's annoying when you have to sort of come over here and like quit out of one program and move into the other. I like to sort of import the video, which is why this presentation software is nice, is that you can bring the video right in. It sits right on one of your slides. I decide when it starts by just clicking the advance. All right, So let's move on. I want to make sure that we get to everything. So we're going to move into the third phase, which is delivery. And delivery is often the most neglected phase because we never give ourselves enough time to practice and prepare for the delivery. We spend so much time developing content and designing slides. It's the night before, you've got to deliver, and you'll probably end up better off getting a good night's sleep. But try to give yourself enough time so you can deliver effectively. Because here's the deal. The only thing your audience is judging on is the delivery. They don't care how much time you spent developing content. They don't care how much time you spent delivering your slides. It's game day, and when you're up in front of your audience, you've got to be on. You've got to make it happen. So I'm going to give you some tips that I think will help you. The first of which is to set the stage. And that, when I say stage, I mean sort of controlling the entire room. There's a lot of things that you can do to help increase the sort of powerfulness of your presentation. The first of which actually has to do with sort of physical setups and seats in the room. I think it's better to actually start off as people are coming in to have fewer seats than there are actually a number of people attending. It creates this sense of excitement. It creates this sort of sense of drama. People are hopefully drawn to sit down. Of course, we've got enough seats off on the wings, but people like to be, it's like showing up to the movie theater and having two people there. You're just like, oh, this doesn't feel good. It's like being at a party and being the second person there. So people like this energy. The second thing is, I think it's good to avoid a center aisle. I think energetically, if you have a center aisle going down the middle, it sort of creates this dichotomy of sort of left and right. And I think the energy sort of has this ability to sort of dissipate and go right down the middle because you tend to stand in the middle. I think this sort of sense of unity creates intimacy, and it creates a connection, conscious or not, for the audience. I think get people as close as possible, and I think as a presenter, present as close as possible so that you have this sort of physical connection to your audience. This room is ideal. I'm so thankful for DPR for providing this space because it is the perfect presentation room. And I wanted to present here, one, because we're videoing. Two, I associate myself with a great space. Hopefully, I'll move you along that continuum of know to like to trust. So why is this room really fantastic? One is that you have great control over the lighting. And there's going to be a tour of this particular office after this presentation. Zach is going to lead you on a really amazing tour and explain to you all the sort of, not all, but a lot of the remarkable features to this building. So one thing that is really fantastic is that the projectors are up above my head. And I can walk along here and I don't interrupt your view. And this is rare to have these ceiling mounted projectors. That's fantastic. So what happens if you've got a projector down below and you don't have a screen that is above your head? Well, you have to decide what side of the presentation you're going to stand on. I recommend standing on audience's right because a lot of time if you have typeset and it's flush left, it goes across, and then you provide this sort of nice sort of diagonal visual balance of composition when you think about you and the slide as one physical unit. Of course, you never want to sort of start blocking your slides if you've got a screen right behind you because then people can't see your slides. What are some other things about this? Let's say you're speaking to an audience that's bigger than this room. I would try to recommend, if you have the ability, to get a microphone. This is about the max in terms of your sort of natural voice ability to project. If it's bigger than this, you're going to start yelling, and it's a little annoying to hear, but it's also really fatiguing on the speaker's voice. And to have to sort of throw your voice way beyond, I have no problem with projection, but if I do that, and I've done it, and then the next day I wake up and I feel like I'm hungover, because I've just expended so much energy in just getting the words out. So use a mic if you can. I think it's really great not to use a podium. There was one here, and I said, no, I don't want to use it. A podium is a barrier between you and your audience. And you want to remove any sort of impediment between you and your audience. You want to create as much connection as you possibly can. So I set up my laptop here. I've got what the slides are. I can look at this, and I don't have to turn around and look at the slides every time. The other thing you want to consider, and this is really hard to resist, but keep the lights on. This room, again, is fantastic because you have total control. What we did was we kept the lights on here for you, the audience, because if you darken the lights, and a lot of rooms have one switch, and the lights are either on or off, right? But this kept you, the audience, well lit, because if you have them in the dark, they're going to want to go to sleep. But they have the ability to turn these lights off up here, which then benefits or affects what your visuals are really great. If you have to choose between lighting yourself, why? You're the star, rather than lighting your slides. Today's modern projectors are really pretty good, and they can throw enough lumens up on the screen that people can see. And I know this is hard to resist because you've spent so much time designing these beautiful slides, you think you've got to put them in the dark. But when you put yourself in the dark and the audience in the dark, it's a bad recipe. Another thing with the presentation is don't be afraid to go beyond the two-dimensional. Of course, your slides are going to be the majority of your presentation. But if you've got three-dimensional props, use them by all means. And if there's the option to sort of go out and work the crowd during your presentation, then do that well. We call this in theater breaking the fourth wall, going out into the audience. There's some fantastic TED presentations. Anybody seen this one? Jill Bolte Taylor. She gives this TED presentation. She's a neuroscientist, and she had a stroke. The amazing thing is that while she was having this stroke, she had enough cognition to be able to understand what was medically happening in her brain. So she tells this incredible story about what happened and what she learned from it. Well, about halfway through the presentation, somebody brings her this prop. She puts on these surgical gloves, and they hand her a real human brain. It's preserved in formaldehyde. But I mean, talk about a visceral, powerful moment. I mean, everyone in the audience just sort of gasp and pays really close attention. So if there's 3D objects, don't feel totally limited to what's happening on the screen. In fact, multimedia, multi-senses, multi-dimensional is going to be more impactful for your audience. Your screen is not a teleprompter. You're thinking, well, I'm not going to be able to memorize a 2-hour presentation. But if you're following this advice of not putting all the words and not putting a bunch of words on there, this works really easily because this is easy to remember. And if you've got what we call a confidence monitor, it's got your slide, you don't have to turn around and read it. But as I said, people can read twice as fast. People can read the content twice as fast as you can speak. And so if you're standing and turning and reading, it just is a disaster. Notice when I put this slide up for the very first time, I asked you all to read it because you can read faster than I can speak. The other thing is we're just not wired to both hear and read verbal content simultaneously. And so it creates this disconnect. And people should do one or the other. So let me share with you what's happening technically. I'm going to sort of open up the kimono and reveal to you behind the curtain. I know it's a strong visual, and apologize this early in the morning. But I want to share with you, so this is what you're seeing on the screen right now, which is a black, blank slide. Well, here's what I'm seeing on what I call the confidence monitor. So this is what you're seeing, current slide. This is what I'm seeing, which are my cue cards or notes. And so these are talking points that I want to make about a particular slide. I also am seeing what the next slide is going to be so that I can have a really smooth transition from one slide to another. And I have the ability to set this in several different ways. Today I'm using time because I know we started at 10 and we need to finish at noon. You can also set a timer that times up or times down. You can set things up and arrange them however you want. This is called the sort of presenter view, and I'm using Keynote to make this presentation. The other software have something similar. But what it does is it allows me to kind of see things that I can look at peripherally without having to turn and read the screen. I don't have to read from my notes. There's nothing wrong with occasionally, if you've got a really critical quote and you want to get it right, it creates a sense of importance and drama when you pick something up and read it. But I think it's also really polished and really professional when you don't have a bunch of other stuff that just gets in the way of your message. So I am, as you noticed, advancing these slides with a remote. And the beauty of this is that I don't have to play this, so for an audience, visual tennis match of speaking, coming over here, going back and forth, and your eyes are going do, do. It untethers you from your mothership and lets you kind of be wherever you want. These things are cheap, $40. It's got a lot of great features. It's got the ability, to, of course, to move forward and back. It's also, as you can see, it's got a laser pointer. It's got the ability to affect the audio. And this is a really powerful tool which makes the screen go black. And the reason this is powerful is because a lot of times you'll be talking about something, somebody may ask a question, or you may go off on somewhat of a tangent. Improv, I think, is fantastic. But if what you're talking about is radically different than what's on the screen, it again creates this disconnect. And people want to have synchronicity. You should be talking about and being supported by what's on the screen. So let's say I go off on this tangent. I'm not talking about this anymore. I'm talking about something else. Real quickly, I can make the screen go black. And that works out really, really well. There's another trick you can do if you know that you're going to be talking about something that is totally unrelated, or you just want nothing on the screen so all the focus is on you, which is to actually put an all-black slide as one of your slides in your presentation. Then you just click to the next slide, it goes all black. One of the problems is with that, though, is that people, I think, sometimes think, oh, something went wrong, the light went out. It's sort of like people aren't used to it. But it can be used for dramatic effect to create almost a visual interruption. I recommend that you animate with moderation. I think animations, and there's two ways within a slideshow to animate. One is builds, which is adding information sequentially in real time, just-in-time engineering, if you will. The other is the transitions from one slide to the next. And you're going to be tempted when you maybe first start working on the software. It comes loaded with all these crazy fire and explosions, kind of like that kid was doing with his dad. Again, if you're presenting to 11-year-old boys, perfect. But mostly you're presenting to professionals, and it just gets a little annoying and tedious after a while. So I think go minimal on that. Of course, it can work really well. You're introducing things sequentially at a time. In a grid like this, it can happen both with the rows, and then it can also happen with the columns. Here's an example of what I'm saying to avoid. So again, if you're presenting to 6-year-old girls who are into fairies and pixie dust, great, go big. But in most cases, that's not the case. So I want to give you another strategy for transitions, and it has to do with, let's say you have an image that for some reason is bigger than the sort of aspect ratio or letterbox of your screen. Like this is an image that's really tall, and I want to be able to show it to you. If I condense it all down into one slide, you can see you can't see much at all. Let's say I take this and break it up into thirds. Now I show you the top third. I have a transition that pushes it up and shows you the middle third, and then it pushes it up again and you see the third third. This creates a really nice effect in that it feels like, it's basically an optical illusion. It feels like something is growing or animating, and really what it is it's just the transition from one to the next. Let me show you what I'm talking about. All right, different classes of typography, sans serif, serif, we learned all about that. Boom, moves up to the middle third, we can talk about that, and then bam, the bottom third. So now you can focus in on what I'm talking about and move from one to the X. So I know there's a lot of smart people in this room, and you're thinking, whoa, would that work horizontally? Ooh, that would work really well if I was doing some sort of chronological thing, because chronologically we're used to sort of going from left until right. What if we had this thing sort of move across? In fact, maybe we're telling this story and we want to tell it in a way that sort of takes people through different decades. We could actually have it move across and introduce a decade at a time and feel like this sort of panorama that's kind of moving through, or diorama. When I was in grade school, I made this dinosaur diorama out of a shoebox and chopsticks and wrapped it. Well, this is sort of the modern equivalent to that, and it works really well. Someone asked about this, what happens, Jim Mumford asked, what happens when things go wrong? Again, you've got to have a plan B. Every time I present, I have a written script. I have everything that is existing on the slides here. It's just in case the projector fails, in case the computer fails. The more you add elements of technology, video, sound, motion, clicker, something could go wrong. And so you've got to have some sort of backup in place. It just makes you more confident as a presenter because something's going to go wrong and you just need to roll with it. So I have a backup battery for this. I have this presentation loaded on a thumb drive, both in PowerPoint, as a PDF, and as Keynote. So in case some of the software goes out, I didn't, but I usually make arrangements to have somebody else bring a laptop. In the car is another projector and another screen, should one of these fail. So that redundancy just makes me not freak out. And the more you do that, the better. This is hard. I love presenting, and I hate practicing, but I force myself to do it because I see that it actually makes a huge difference. But it's really hard standing in your office or at home talking to a wall. It's just painful. Luckily, I sometimes will have friends that I can practice with. I'm involved with a Toastmasters group where I can practice speaking. So as much as you can, rehearse, rehearse, rehearse. And here's what happens is you are up against deadlines. You're not getting paid to, creating your presentation isn't a billable hour. So you wait and you wait and you spend all night designing it, and then you don't have time to rehearse. But you've got to do it because it makes such a difference. And you also need to time yourself. You need to know about where the beats are in your presentation that you need to hit so that if you're getting a little bit behind, and I don't know if you noticed it, but I didn't show you a particular video because I'm looking at the clock and I'm knowing that I want to get you out of here by noon. So practicing lets you know how long certain sections are supposed to be, so then you can make decisions about including that content or not. Smartphones are great for this. All of them have a timing feature. Most of them also have the ability to capture video. So it's really great to do a demo or a walkthrough of your presentation, video yourself. And trust me, it's painful to watch your own self on video, but it's so enlightening. You learn so much. I mentioned Toastmasters. I'm involved with 2 different clubs. Lisa here is involved with one of the clubs with me, SMPS Go-To Toastmasters. Karen and Rafi and Ravi are here, and Barbara from our Del Mar Toastmasters. It's a phenomenal place to learn to become a better presenter. Very supportive, very fun. It's not just about giving toasts. It's really sort of about developing leadership skills, and one of those core leadership skills is the ability to get up and present your ideas. So what about timing? How do you know, let's say you've been given a 40-minute slot in a conference. How do you know how much content that actually is? Again, you've got to rehearse. I would recommend sort of doing your introduction, timing that, and sort of gauging that in relationship. Let's say your introduction is going to be 1/5 of your entire presentation. Practice your introduction. That takes 5 minutes. If it's 1/5, your content will be 25 minutes, more or less. I'm not saying that equal sections should be equal, but you need to start to get a sense of where you are before you've invested in designing and delivering the whole presentation, and certainly before you get up on stage and deliver, and you're halfway through your presentation, and people have got to go because they're on to the next session, they got to go to lunch. You got to be respectful of people's time. A good rule of thumb, let's say it's a 30-minute presentation. I think a 3-minute intro, I think 3 8-minute points, develop, design, deliver, and then a 3-minute conclusion works really well. That's a real sort of basic template that you might be able to use. Don't give out your slides. This relates to your question or your comment about having a handout. It's not because my slides are sacred or there's intellectual property issues. It's that if you've designed your slides well, they should not live without you as the presenter. You need to be the one that's filling in the gaps and making this sort of connection between verbal and visual. I think, and why I did it, and I'm trying to model behavior that you'll adopt, is creating a great handout can work really well. All the sort of key points are in this handout, and people can take that. Other options you can do, relating to Rafi's question, is what if you've got supporting information that goes with a graph that would never live or wouldn't make any sense if somebody just saw the graph? Well, let me show you an example of how to accomplish that. This is a great book by Carmen Gallo, Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs. He's talking about this concept of the fact that people don't have to take notes during a presentation. So this is one presentation. He does a save as. He creates a whole nother presentation deck that he doesn't deliver, but he passes out, puts it on something like SlideShare or distributes it, and he goes in and he adds a layer of what his verbal content would be. So 2 different ways you can do this. All right, so just to review real quickly, we're going to set the stage. control the room so it supports what we want to do. Try to move beyond 3D, introduce props, create a wow experience, something like the forklift. Don't read your slides. Definitely use a remote. If you're going to animate in moderation. And certainly practice, practice, practice. And as I just mentioned, I don't think giving out your slides adds much benefit unless you've gone back and created another slideshow that's got all the content. All right, so one quick question for the free prize. Who can tell me why a presenter shouldn't just read slides? Somebody who hasn't answered yet. Lisa, you know.
Because then you're turning your back on the audience.
Yeah.
So you're just engaging them, and the audience will read it faster than
Totally.
you can speak it.
Exactly.
And it's boring.
Yeah.
It's boring, exactly. There's nothing that alienates or bores an audience quicker. All right, so we're going to keep moving. I'll be around after if you have any questions. I just want to express some thanks. I'm going to do a wrap-up, but there's some things that I want to sort of say. I want to thank Whitney and Zach and DPR for hosting this really great day in an amazing environment. Please stick around, take the tour. You can learn about how this building actually produces more energy than it needs to run. It's a net zero building, and it's a really remarkable place. So thank you guys very much for allowing me to present here. I'm going to be giving 10% of your ticket price to the DPR charity, Stand Up for Kids. So by just showing up, you all are helping to change the world and make it a better place. They are doing some great things in keeping kids off the streets and help prevent children homelessness. Also want to thank Chris Giles, who's been awesome, a professional photographer and videographer, who's shooting today. We're going to make this DVD available for sale afterward. Want to thank my wife, Holly Lecours, for helping out with registration, listening to me present and rehearse over and over again, being very patient. All right, so let's say you learned a lot and you want to go further. Well, you've got to put this into practice. All the theory in the world is great, but you've got to actually get out and make it happen. So try to find a presentation if you don't have one that you're thinking of or have to present. I know you've got one you're doing next week at a big conference, and so get out there and start to put it into action. Review the handout, of course. On the handout, there's a list of books if you want to go deeper. Those are my sort of bibliography that I use to help develop this presentation. I'm available for hire if you want one-on-one training for your next presentation. I'm also available to come in and do a presentation like this, either for your big company or for your trade organization, if you think this could be beneficial to the rest of your team. So let's wrap it up. Today, what we talked about was 3 aspects. We talked about development and how coming up with the content, organizing it, coming up with the shell or outline is really the critical first step. And as I said, the most important and the best use of your computer during this phase is this. Just use it to put your stickies on. Next phase is design, where you're designing the layout of your particular slides. And if there's one takeaway, it's just keep it simple. Less is more. If Al Gore can present about climate change using simple graphs, then by golly, you can too. And then finally, in terms of delivery, you're the star. Create an experience. Create something that people talk about, that people learn about, that they'll spread virally. A great example of that was when Jill Bolte-Taylor brought this brain out. You're the star. So make it great and make it happen. So I firmly believe that your presentations can change your world. And all that has to happen is you just have to connect with one person in your audience, like Al Gore connected with Laurie David. And then that person can go out and spread that message to their friends and their friends. And so by connecting with your world, you end up changing the world. And I have no doubt that you can change the world. And if not now, when? When are you going to do it? I hope it's your next presentation. And I hope you invite me to come watch you present.